In the fall of 1949, a 30-year-old preacher nobody outside a small religious circuit had heard of was standing in a circus tent in a Los Angeles parking lot, talking to a few thousand people a night. His crusade was supposed to end in 3 weeks. It was already underperforming. Then, in an office miles away, one of the most powerful men in America picked up a pen and wrote 2 words: Puff Graham. Within days, that preacher's face was on front pages from New York to San Francisco. The tent that once struggled to fill grew to hold 9,000 people, and it still wasn't big enough. The 3-week revival stretched to 8, and a man named Billy Graham walked out of that parking lot as one of the most famous religious figures in American history. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. Historians still aren't entirely sure that telegram ever existed the way the legend describes it. Tonight, we're telling the real story behind the man, the machine that built him, the discipline that protected him for 6 decades, and the mystery buried inside his own most famous origin story.
It's been in all denominations, whether it's Episcopal or Roman Catholic or wherever.
Billy Graham was born on November 7th, 1918, on a dairy farm outside Charlotte, North Carolina. His childhood was ordinary in almost every way. Chores before school, a strict Presbyterian household, nothing that would have marked him out as a future household name. He came to faith seriously as a teenager during a local revival, eventually training at Bible colleges in Florida and Illinois, before becoming a traveling evangelist in his 20s. By the late 1940s, he was working the revival circuit through an organization called Youth for Christ, preaching to modest crowds across the country and overseas. It was steady work. It wasn't stardom. By his own account, and by the account of historians who've studied this period closely, Graham was genuinely discouraged heading into 1949. He'd been on the circuit for a couple of years without the kind of breakthrough that separated a working evangelist from a famous one. He seriously considered stepping away from revival preaching altogether. Then a Los Angeles ministry group invited him to lead a series of tent meetings that September, scheduled to run 3 weeks. Nobody involved expected it to become the turning point of his life. The Christ Greater Los Angeles Committee erected a circus tent, big enough for 6,000 people, on a parking lot at the corner of Washington and Hill Street. The crusade opened on September 25th, 1949. For the first few weeks, it was unremarkable. Attendance hovered around 3,000 to 4,000 a night, filling maybe half the tent. It was a respectable turnout for a regional evangelist. It was not the kind of number that makes national news. Then 2 things happened almost back to back. A well-known radio cowboy personality named Stuart Hamblin, a heavy drinker known across Los Angeles, publicly converted at one of Graham's meetings and quit drinking on the spot. A genuinely newsworthy local story on its own. Around the same time, word of the growing crowds and celebrity conversions started reaching a man who owned more newspapers than almost anyone alive, William Randolph Hearst. Here's where the legend everyone repeats comes in. According to the most widely told version of the story, Hearst, who by most accounts had no particular religious devotion himself, sent a 2-word directive to editors across his entire newspaper empire: Puff Graham. Journalism slang for one thing: cover this man favorably and cover him often. Whatever the exact mechanism, the effect was immediate and undeniable. Graham was on front pages across the country within days. Newsreels picked up the story. Other papers, watching Hearst's coverage, followed his lead so they wouldn't be scooped on what was suddenly being treated as a national phenomenon. The crusade that was supposed to wrap up in 3 weeks got extended, week after week, eventually running a full 8 weeks and drawing an estimated 350,000 people through the tent before it finally closed. Billy Graham himself wrote, decades later in his autobiography, that he never learned exactly why Hearst took an interest in him. The 2 men never met, never spoke by phone, and never corresponded for the rest of Hearst's life. Graham simply became famous, seemingly overnight, at the direction of a man he had no relationship with at all. Now here's the twist historians have quietly been raising for decades. No original copy of that Puff Graham telegram has ever surfaced. Hearst's own son later disputed the exact wording, suggesting his father more likely said something closer to, "Give attention to Billy Graham's meetings." A real instruction, but a far less dramatic one than the two-word command that's been retold in biography after biography since the 1950s. The story may be true in spirit and softened in detail, or it may be one of the most successful pieces of religious mythology of the 20th century. Either way, it did exactly what a great origin story is supposed to do. It made an unlikely rise feel inevitable. A single newspaper push explains a famous month. It doesn't explain a 60-year career. What turned Billy Graham from a media moment into a permanent institution came down to three things he did right in the years that followed. First, his message landed at exactly the right moment. Post-war America was anxious. The Cold War was accelerating. The atomic bomb had changed what fear meant on a national scale. And Graham's forceful anti-communist framing of the Christian message resonated with an audience already primed to hear it. It's also worth noting that resonance may explain Hearst's interest in the first place. Hearst had spent years pushing his own anti-communist editorial agenda, and a young preacher delivering that same message from a pulpit was, whether by coincidence or design, useful to him. Second, Graham understood media distribution before almost anyone else in ministry did. He moved from tent revivals into radio broadcasts, then into television specials, and eventually into satellite broadcasts reaching audiences in dozens of countries simultaneously. He treated a sermon less like a single event and more like a product that could be recorded, distributed, and repeated at scale. An approach that looked unusual for a preacher in the 1950s and looks almost obvious in hindsight now. Third, and this is the part that actually protected everything he built, Graham and a small group of fellow evangelists sat down in 1948, the year before the Los Angeles Crusade, and drafted an informal code of conduct for themselves. It became known later as the Modesto Manifesto. The rules were blunt. Never travel, meet, or dine alone with a woman who wasn't his wife. Full transparency and outside auditing of all ministry finances, with no personal enrichment beyond a fixed published salary. No exaggerating attendance numbers or claim results from crusades. It sounds almost bureaucratic. It's also the single biggest reason Graham's reputation survived intact for 6 decades in an industry that, over the following decades, produced one financial and moral scandal after another among television evangelists. He built the guardrails before the fame arrived, not after the damage was already done. What followed the Los Angeles Crusade was one of the longest sustained runs of public influence any religious figure has held in American history. Graham held crusades across the country and internationally through the 1950s, filling stadiums in an era before modern sound systems and video screens made that logistically easy. He became informally a spiritual advisor to a remarkable run of American presidents. From Eisenhower through Obama, across party lines, a bridge figure trusted by leaders who agreed on almost nothing else. He was in the room in various capacities for some of the most consequential moments of the second half of the 20th century, while carefully avoiding formal partisan alignment that might have cost him half his audience. His marriage to Ruth Bell, whom he'd married in 1943 before any of this began, lasted 63 years until her death in 2007. Their children included Franklin Graham, who eventually took over leadership of his father's ministry organization, carrying the Graham name into a new, more overtly political era of evangelicalism that looked quite different from his father's studiously nonpartisan public persona.
Billy and Ruth Graham had 5 children together, and their paths afterward tell their own quiet story about what it means to inherit a name like this one. Franklin Graham became the most public of the 5, taking over as president and CEO of his father's own organization, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, along with leading the international relief charity Samaritan's Purse. Unlike his father's carefully non-partisan public image, Franklin has become an outspoken, often politically controversial figure in his own right. a different chapter of the Graham name playing out in a far more polarized media era than his father ever preached in. Anne Graham Lotz built her own respected ministry, Angel Ministries, and became one of the most sought-after Christian speakers and authors of her generation, largely independent of her father's organization. Ruth Bunny Graham kept a quieter, more private life, writing and speaking on her own terms, away from the level of public attention her brother Franklin carries. Virginia Gigi Graham, the eldest daughter, also became a well-known author and speaker within evangelical circles. She passed away in 2020 after a battle with cancer. Nelson Ned Graham, the youngest, led his own smaller ministry for years, living the most out of the public eye of all 5 siblings. And the Graham name didn't stop there. Franklin's own son, Will Graham, followed both his father and grandfather into evangelism, now leading crusades of his own. A third generation carrying forward the very machine that a 2-word telegram may or may not have started 75 years ago in a parking lot in Los Angeles.
Billy Graham died on February 21, 2018, at his home in Montreat, North Carolina. He was 99 years old enough to have preached to nearly every generation of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st. The official story of his rise is a 2-word telegram from a newspaper baron who never met him. The more complicated truth is that no single telegram, real, embellished, or entirely mythologized, turns an unknown 30-year-old preacher into a figure who advises a dozen presidents across 6 decades. Hearst may have opened the door. It was Graham's own understanding of media, message, and self-discipline that kept him standing in it for the rest of his life. Even the most famous version of his origin story turns out to be more legend than document. And maybe that tells you something true about fame itself, religious or otherwise. The story people repeat is rarely the whole story. Did the Hearst telegram surprise you? Or did the discipline behind the Modesto Manifesto? Let us know in the comments. And if stories about the real machinery behind famous names are your thing, subscribe because we've got more of them coming.